How did your boss take things too far when punishing an employee? I was halfway through my shift at the restaurant when the hot oil splashed across my hand and I dropped the fryer basket. Manager Rick stormed over from the office. "Tyler! What the hell? That's coming out of your paycheck!" My hand was already blistering, skin bubbling up white and angry. "Rick, I need to go to urgent care. This is a second-degree burn." He grabbed my wrist, examining it like merchandise. "Burn? This? My grandfather worked steel mills with real burns. You millennials can't handle a little kitchen heat?" I tried to pull away, but he held tighter. "Please, I need ice at least. You know what you need? To toughen up. When I was your age, we didn't cry over every little boo-boo." He turned to the other staff who'd stopped working to watch. "This is why I don't hire college boys. They think they're too good for real work." My hand was screaming. The stress was triggering my stutter that I'd hidden for 2 years at this job. I bit my tongue hard to keep the words from breaking apart. "You want to act like a baby? Fine. You can wash dishes one-handed for the rest of your shift. Maybe that'll teach you to be more careful." "Rick, that's illegal. I need medical attention for a workplace injury." His face went red. "Illegal? You threatening me, college boy? Your daddy gonna sue me?" My father had died when I was 15. Rick knew this. I'd taken bereavement days 6 months ago for the anniversary. The comment hit exactly where he intended. "Get in the dish pit, now, or clean out your locker." I needed this job. Rent was due in 3 days. My mom was counting on me to help with my sister's medical bills, so I went to the dish pit. The hot water on my burned hand made me scream. Rick laughed from the kitchen. "Listen to him crying. This is what happens when parents coddle their kids." Sarah, the other line cook, tried to intervene. "Rick, he needs a hospital. Look at his hand. You want to join him? I've got plenty of dishes." For 2 hours, I washed dishes while my hand swelled and blistered. The pain was making me dizzy. Every plate felt like torture. Rick kept coming by to comment. "In my day, we worked through broken bones. This is why women are taking over. Men have gone soft. Bet you've never done a real day's work in your life." The stress finally broke my control. My stutter exploded out. I need to go to the hospital." Rick's eyes lit up with cruel delight. "Oh my God! College boy has a speech impediment. No wonder you can't handle real work. You're broken." He started mimicking me to the other staff. I'm too weak." They looked horrified, but nobody spoke up. That's when I collapsed. The pain, dehydration, and stress caused me to pass out right into the dish pit. My burned hand hit the metal edge and split open. Sarah finally had enough. She called 911 despite Rick screaming that she was fired. When paramedics arrived, Rick tried to block them, insisting I was faking for workers' comp. The EMT took one look at my hand, now infected, swollen to twice its size, with third-degree burns from the continued exposure, and called the police. "This man needs immediate surgery. This is criminal negligence." Rick snapped, started ranting about soft generation, lawsuit culture, fake injuries. He actually grabbed the EMT, trying to prevent treatment. They arrested him on the spot. But when they searched his office for incident reports, they found something that changed everything. 3 other employees had been hospitalized with untreated injuries over the past year. One had lost partial use of her hand. Another had permanent nerve damage, all forced to work through serious injuries. But the worst discovery was in his desk drawer, a journal where he documented deliberately injuring employees he wanted to fire, making it look like their fault to avoid unemployment claims. My name was on the next page. The accident with the oil hadn't been an accident at all. I woke up in the hospital with my hand wrapped in thick bandages and an IV in my arm. The fluorescent lights hurt my eyes. A doctor stood next to my bed checking a tablet. She looked up when I moved. The bandages on my hand felt heavy and tight. My fingers throbbed with a deep ache that made me sick to my stomach. The doctor pulled up a chair and sat down close to the bed. She explained they had to do emergency surgery because the infection spread into the tissue beneath the burn. Her voice was calm, but serious. She said if I'd waited another few hours, I might have lost function in 3 fingers permanently. The words hit me hard. 3 fingers. Permanently. I stared at the bandages, trying to process what that meant. The doctor kept talking about tissue damage and bacterial infection and surgical debridement. I nodded like I understood, but my brain felt fuzzy from whatever pain medication they had me on. The next morning, a woman in a dark suit came into my room. She introduced herself as Detective Maggie Booker. She carried a tablet and pulled the visitor chair closer to my bed. Her expression was serious and focused. She swiped through photos on her tablet, and then turned it toward me. The screen showed pages from Rick's journal spread across the display. My stomach dropped. She zoomed in on one page and I saw my name written in Rick's handwriting. The entry was dated 2 days before my burn happened. It said, "Oil accident. Make it look like carelessness," in neat block letters. I read it 3 times trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maggie watched my face carefully. She explained they found the journal in Rick's desk drawer during the search after my collapse. She said there were entries for other employees too. Each one documented a planned injury designed to look accidental. The realization hit me hard. Rick planned this. He heated that oil extra hot. He waited until I was tired and distracted at the end of a long shift. He created the accident that was supposed to make me quit. My hands started shaking. The 4th line pulled at my arm. I felt my breath coming faster. Rick didn't just lose his temper. He deliberately hurt me. He wrote it down 2 days before it happened like he was planning a business meeting. Maggie kept talking, but I couldn't focus on her words. My whole body started trembling. The heart monitor started beeping faster. A nurse rushed in and checked my vitals. She looked concerned. Maggie stepped back to give the nurse room. The nurse asked if I was okay, but I couldn't answer. My chest felt tight. She pressed a button and said something about anxiety. She gave me something through the IV that made the shaking slow down. The room got quieter. My breathing evened out. But I couldn't stop thinking about Rick's handwriting spelling out my injury like a grocery list. Maggie sat back down once the nurse left. She told me Rick had been arrested and charged with assault, criminal negligence, and labor law violations. That should have made me feel better. But then she said his lawyer already posted bail. He was out, walking around free while I was stuck in this hospital bed with a ruined hand. The thought made me so angry I wanted to throw something. Maggie must have seen it on my face because she said they had conditions on his release. He couldn't come near me or the restaurant. He had to surrender his passport. But none of that changed the fact that he was home sleeping in his own bed while I was here with bandages covering burned flesh and damaged nerves. The unfairness of it made my jaw clench. Maggie said the evidence was strong. The journal, the security footage, the witness statements. She seemed confident about the case, but I didn't care about confidence. I wanted him in a cell. Sarah came to visit that afternoon. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were red like she'd been crying. She sat in the chair and wouldn't look directly at me at first. She said she should have called 911 the moment I got burned instead of waiting until I collapsed. Her voice cracked. She said she was sorry. She said she was a coward for not acting sooner. I told her she saved my life by finally making that call despite Rick's threats. I meant it. If she hadn't called when she did, the infection might have cost me my whole hand. She started crying for real then. She said Rick fired her the next day for creating a hostile work environment. She said she didn't care. She said she should have done it hours earlier. We sat there for a while, not saying much. Sometimes there aren't words that fix things. My mom arrived after her shift, still wearing her work clothes. She looked older somehow. The lines around her eyes seemed deeper. When she saw my bandaged hand and the IV and all the medical equipment, she just stopped in the doorway. I tried to smile to show her I was okay, but she saw through it. She came over and sat on the edge of the bed carefully. I told her about the surgery and the infection. I told her what the doctor said about waiting any longer. Her face went pale. Then I had to tell her about the surgery costs. Our insurance through the restaurant had a $5,000 deductible. We didn't have $5,000. We barely had $500. She just sat there staring at my hand. Then she put her face in her hands and cried. Not loud crying. Quiet crying that somehow felt worse. I wanted to comfort her. But what could I say? Rick didn't just hurt my hand. He hurt my whole family. The next day, a woman in a business suit showed up at my door. She introduced herself as Joanne Singleton from a workers' compensation law firm. She said she saw the news coverage about my case. She said she wanted to represent me for free. I didn't understand why a lawyer would work for free. She sat down and explained that Rick's deliberate injury meant this went way beyond normal workplace accident claims. This was assault. This was criminal behavior. She said cases like mine were why she became a lawyer. She talked fast and confident. She said we could go after Rick personally and the restaurant chain that employed him. She said they had a responsibility to protect employees, and they failed. She asked if I wanted her help. I said yes, before she finished the question. Joanne opened her briefcase and pulled out some papers. She told me about 2 other former employees she'd already contacted. Nadia Harper, who lost partial use of her hand. Clayton Mendez, who has permanent nerve damage in his shoulder. They both worked for Rick. They both had similar stories of forced work through serious injuries. Joanne said their cases strengthened mine. She said it showed a pattern of behavior. She said Rick's journal mentioned them too. She said we could build something bigger than just my case. She said we could stop Rick from ever doing this to anyone else. The way she talked made me believe it was possible. She left me papers to sign and her card with 3 different phone numbers. She said to call anytime, day or night, if I needed anything. The surgeon came back later that day with my post-op results. She pulled up images on her tablet showing scans of my hand. She pointed to areas where the nerve damage was visible. The news wasn't great. I had nerve damage in my index and middle fingers that might be permanent. She used words like compromised function and reduced sensation and motor control impairment. She said 6 months of physical therapy might restore 80% function. Might. 80%. She said I'd probably never have full dexterity again. I asked what that meant for regular activities. She said writing would be harder. Typing would be slower. Fine motor tasks would be difficult. She said some people adapt well. Some people struggle. She couldn't predict which category I'd fall into. She said we'd know more after therapy started. She tried to sound hopeful, but I could hear the caution in her voice. I lay there after she left, staring at the ceiling tiles. I'm 22 years old. The doctor just told me my dominant hand might never work right again. Rick planned to hurt me badly enough that I'd quit rather than file for unemployment. He wrote it down. He executed his plan. He succeeded. My hand would never be the same. My career in restaurants was probably over. My family was drowning in medical debt we couldn't pay. The unfairness of it made me want to scream, but screaming wouldn't fix my hand. It wouldn't pay the bills. It wouldn't put Rick in jail. So I just lay there staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out what came next. The next morning, a man in a dark suit knocked on my hospital room door and introduced himself as Sean McDonnell from the State Labor Board. He carried a leather briefcase and set up a small recording device on the table beside my bed. He asked if I was willing to give a formal statement about what happened at the restaurant. I nodded, and he pressed record. He walked me through everything step by step. The burn itself. Rick refusing to let me get medical help. The forced work in the dish pit with my hand getting worse by the minute. The threats about losing my job if I didn't keep working. The mockery when my stutter came out. Sean took notes while the recorder captured everything I said. He asked specific questions about whether Rick had ever made other employees work through injuries. I told him about the times I'd seen people limping or holding their arms funny, but still working their shifts. He asked if anyone had ever complained to corporate. I said I didn't know, but I'd heard rumors. Sean leaned back in his chair and told me the restaurant chain was facing massive fines for safety violations. He said they might also face criminal charges for allowing Rick's behavior to continue after receiving complaints. He asked if I knew about the 3 other employees who'd been hospitalized. I said I only learned about them when the police searched Rick's office. Sean made more notes and said my testimony would be crucial for the labor board investigation. He left his card and said he'd be in touch as the case developed. My phone buzzed an hour after Sean left. A text from my sister. She said she had to postpone her specialist appointment because Mom used that money for my hospital copay. The message sat there on my screen, making my chest tight. My sister had been waiting 2 months for this appointment. The specialist was supposed to figure out why her medication wasn't working anymore. Now she had to wait another 6 weeks minimum to get back on the schedule. I typed out a response 3 times and deleted it each time because what could I say? Sorry my workplace injury cost you your medical care. The guilt felt worse than the pain in my hand. Rick didn't just hurt me. He hurt my whole family. My sister sent another text saying it was okay and not to worry, but I knew she was scared about her symptoms getting worse. Mom had been juggling bills for months, trying to keep everyone's medical needs covered. Now, my emergency surgery had blown a hole in the budget we couldn't fix. I put my phone face down on the bed and stared at the ceiling tiles again. Sarah called that afternoon, and I could hear she'd been crying. Her voice shook when she told me the restaurant fired her. They claimed she created a hostile work environment by calling 911 against management's direct orders. She said the termination letter accused her of insubordination and failure to follow proper procedures. I asked what proper procedures they meant. She said apparently she was supposed to file an incident report and wait for management approval before calling emergency services. The whole thing was insane. She saved my life, and they fired her for it. Sarah told me her rent was due in 12 days, and she'd been looking for other restaurant jobs, but nobody was hiring. She was scared she wouldn't find anything before her landlord started eviction proceedings. Rick's revenge extended even to the person who saved my life. I told her to call Joanne because this had to be illegal. Sarah said she couldn't afford a lawyer. I said Joanne was representing me for free and might help her too. She said she'd think about it, but I could hear the defeat in her voice. I called Joanne as soon as I hung up with Sarah. Joanne answered on the second ring and listened while I explained what happened. She was quiet for a moment, then said she'd file an emergency motion to get Sarah's termination reversed. She explained that whistleblower protections should cover Sarah's actions since she reported a serious workplace safety violation. Joanne said she'd also demand the restaurant chain pay my medical bills immediately, instead of making us wait for the workers' compensation process. She told me we were building a case that went way beyond Rick to the company that enabled him. Corporate HR had received multiple complaints about Rick over the past 18 months, according to documents Joanne had already obtained. They knew he was dangerous and did nothing. That made them liable too. Joanne said she'd call Sarah directly to discuss representation. She told me to focus on healing and let her handle the legal battles. I thanked her and hung up feeling slightly less helpless. A woman knocked on my door the next morning. She was maybe 30 with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She introduced herself as Nadia Harper and said she used to work at the restaurant under Rick. She asked if she could come in. I said yes, and she sat in the chair beside my bed. Nadia held up her left hand and showed me how her ring finger and pinky finger didn't bend properly anymore. The fingers stayed slightly curved no matter what she did. She told me Rick made her work a full week with an untreated crushing injury after a heavy pot fell on her hand. She thought it was just bruised, but it turned out 3 bones were fractured. By the time she finally went to the doctor, the bones had started healing wrong. She needed surgery to re-break and reset them, but the damage was already done. She'd never have full function again. Nadia said she was too ashamed to report it because Rick convinced her it was her own clumsiness. He told her she needed to be more careful and pay better attention. He made her feel like the injury was entirely her fault. She quit 2 months later when the pain made it impossible to do her job properly. Seeing the news coverage about my case made her realize Rick had been doing this to people for years. That afternoon, I got a long email from Clayton Mendez. He wrote that he'd worked for Rick 3 years ago and had a similar experience. Rick made him lift heavy boxes of supplies for 6 hours, even though Clayton kept saying his shoulder hurt. Clayton thought he'd just pulled a muscle, but the pain got worse over the following days. He finally went to the doctor and found out he had a torn rotator cuff. He needed surgery and 8 months of physical therapy. Even now, he couldn't raise his arm above his head without pain. The injury ended his plans to join the military because he failed the physical. Clayton said Rick told him the injury happened because he had poor lifting technique and weak shoulders. Rick made him feel like he'd failed at being tough enough for restaurant work. Clayton wrote that he wished he'd reported Rick back then, but he was young and didn't know his rights. He said if testifying now would help stop Rick from hurting other people, he'd do it. I read the email twice and felt sick thinking about how many people Rick had damaged over the years. The hospital discharged me on the 3rd day with a thick packet of paperwork. The discharge nurse went over my prescriptions: antibiotics for the infection, pain medication for the nerve damage, special cream for the burn scars. The pharmacy bill came to $340 even with insurance. I didn't have $340. The nurse also gave me a referral to a hand specialist I was supposed to see in 1 week. She said I needed physical therapy 3 times a week starting in 2 weeks. I asked how much that would cost. She said it depended on my insurance, but probably $50 per session. $50 3 times a week for months. The numbers made my head spin. I had to call Mom to come pick me up because I couldn't drive with my hand wrapped up. While I waited in the discharge area, I tried to practice saying simple sentences without stuttering. The financial stress was making my stutter come back every time I tried to talk. Even basic words were breaking apart in my mouth. Mom took a full week off work without pay to help me at home. She said I couldn't manage alone with my hand wrapped up and still healing. I told her she didn't need to do that. She said yes, she did, and that was the end of the discussion. But I knew what it meant. Her hourly job didn't offer paid time off. Every day she stayed home with me was money we didn't have. We were falling further behind on bills that were already late. The electricity bill was overdue. The water bill had a cutoff warning. My sister's medication refill was coming up and cost $200. Mom made lists of expenses and tried to figure out what we could delay paying. I watched her stress and felt like a burden, even though Joanne kept telling me this wasn't my fault and Rick should pay for everything. Fault didn't matter when the bills were due now, and the settlement money might take months. The restaurant owner appeared on the local news that evening. I watched him stand in front of the restaurant in an expensive suit, talking about how shocked and disappointed he was to learn about Rick's behavior. He said he had no idea Rick was abusive and promised full cooperation with investigators. He talked about the company's commitment to employee safety and how this situation didn't reflect their values. He made it sound like Rick was one bad apple who'd somehow slipped through their screening process. Mom turned off the TV in disgust. My phone rang a minute later. Joanne was laughing in a way that sounded more angry than amused. She said she had internal emails proving corporate HR received multiple complaints about Rick over 18 months. Employees reported his threats, his verbal abuse, his pattern of making people work through injuries. HR sent the complaints to the regional manager who sent them to the owner. Everyone knew. They all decided it was cheaper to ignore the problem than fire Rick and risk a wrongful termination lawsuit. Joanne said the owner's TV appearance was going to look really bad in court when she presented those emails as evidence. Detective Maggie Booker called me the next morning. She said they found camera footage from the restaurant's security system that changed everything. The cameras covered the kitchen area, including the fryer station where I got burned. The footage showed Rick deliberately bumping into me from behind right as I was moving past the hot oil. The angle and timing made it clear this wasn't an accident. Rick positioned himself and pushed me at the exact moment that would cause maximum contact with the oil. Maggie said the video made it absolutely clear this was assault, not an accident. It strengthened the criminal case significantly because it proved premeditation. Combined with the journal entries, the prosecution now had overwhelming evidence that Rick planned and executed an attack meant to injure me severely. Maggie said Rick's lawyer was probably going to push for a plea deal once they saw this footage, because taking it to trial would be suicide for his case. Joanne called me 3 days later with news about Rick's lawyer. They wanted a deal where Rick would admit to lesser charges and cover my medical costs if I promised not to talk about how he planned the whole thing. She told me the answer was no before I could even ask what I thought. This wasn't just about me anymore, she said. Rick had hurt other people and would hurt more if we let him walk away easy. The settlement money wouldn't stop him from doing this again at another restaurant. I understood what she meant, but the medical bills were piling up, so fast I could barely breathe when I looked at them. The physical therapy office smelled like rubber mats and cleaning solution. The therapist unwrapped my bandages and examined my hand with careful fingers. She said my name was Rebecca, and she'd worked with burn patients for 12 years. She moved each of my fingers slowly, watching my face when I winced. Then she told me the truth without sugarcoating it. My recovery would take months of painful work, with no promise that my hand would ever work right again. The nerve damage was serious, and the infection had made everything worse. She showed me the first exercise, a simple grip motion that felt like my hand was crushed in a vice. Tears ran down my face, but she didn't tell me to stop. She said the pain meant the nerves were trying to reconnect, and if I didn't push through it now, I might lose the chance for any improvement. We did the exercises for 40 minutes, and by the end, I was shaking and nauseous. She scheduled me for 3 sessions per week and said I needed to practice at home every day, even when it hurt too much to think straight. Sarah called me that evening, crying so hard I could barely understand her words. The restaurant chain had given her the job back with all the pay she'd lost while they had her fired. They also had to cover the costs of the lawyer Joanne got for her. Sarah kept saying thank you over and over until I had to tell her to stop because she'd saved my life and I owed her everything. She told me she'd been 2 days away from eviction and didn't know what she was going to do. Her landlord had already started the paperwork to kick her out. Now she could pay rent and keep her apartment and maybe sleep without panic for the first time in weeks. I felt glad something good had come from this mess, even though my hand still throbbed with every heartbeat. The district attorney's office had gray carpet and fluorescent lights that buzzed. Kieran Wolfe met us in a conference room with a table long enough for 10 people. Nadia sat on my right looking tired, and Clayton sat across from us with his arm in a sling he still needed sometimes. Kieran spread out copies of Rick's journal across the table, along with screenshots from the security footage. He walked us through the evidence piece by piece, showing how Rick's written plans matched up with what actually happened to each of us. The journal had dates and details about how he'd set up each injury to look like our fault. Kieran said this was one of the clearest workplace assault cases he'd seen in 15 years as a prosecutor. Rick's own handwriting proved he'd planned everything deliberately. Combined with the video of him pushing me toward the hot oil and our 3 testimonies about what happened after we got hurt, the case was almost impossible to defend against. The preliminary hearing happened in a courtroom that felt too cold. I sat 15 feet from Rick in a wooden chair that made my back hurt. The judge asked me to describe what happened the night I got burned. I started talking about the fryer and the hot oil and how my hand blistered immediately. Then I had to explain how Rick grabbed my burned hand and squeezed it while he yelled at me. My words started breaking apart the way they always did under stress. The stutter came back full force, and I couldn't get through a sentence without repeating sounds 3 or 4 times. I had to describe Rick mocking my speech in front of everyone, while I tried to wash dishes with a hand that was swelling up like a balloon. The judge watched me struggle to talk and wrote notes on her papers. Kieran told me afterward that my visible distress had actually helped the case because it showed the judge how much trauma Rick had caused. The way my speech fell apart under pressure made it clear I wasn't faking anything. The judge called Rick's behavior a calculated pattern of workplace terrorism after she heard all 3 of us testify. Nadia had shown her damaged hand and explained how Rick made her work for a week with crushed fingers. Clayton described the shoulder injury that Rick ignored until the rotator cuff tore completely. The judge reviewed the journal entries where Rick had written down his plans to hurt each of us. She said she was concerned Rick might try to retaliate against us for testifying and ordered him held without bail until trial. Rick's face stayed blank when the bailiff put handcuffs on him, but I saw his jaw clench tight. Knowing he was locked up made me feel safer, but also strange, like the world had shifted in a way I didn't fully understand yet. Mom sat at the kitchen table that night with bills spread out in front of her. She finally told me something she'd been hiding for 3 years. She'd been working double shifts the whole time to cover my sister's medical costs because the insurance didn't pay for everything. Now, my injury had pushed us right to the edge of bankruptcy. The hospital bills from my surgery kept coming, and the physical therapy costs were adding up fast. We were behind on the electric bill, and the water company had sent a shut-off warning. My sister needed her medication refilled next week, and that cost $200 we didn't have. Mom's voice broke when she said she didn't know how we were going to make it through the next month. I felt crushed by guilt, even though Joanne kept telling me Rick had caused this, not me. But guilt didn't care about logic when I watched my mom cry over bills that existed because I'd gotten hurt at work. The restaurant chain's lawyer called Joanne with a settlement offer for all 3 of us. They would pay our medical bills, cover the wages we'd lost, and give each of us $100,000. The only catch was, we had to sign agreements saying we wouldn't talk publicly about what happened. Clayton called me right after he heard about the offer. He said he needed that money desperately and was going to take it. His shoulder surgery had cost more than mine, and he couldn't work construction anymore with the nerve damage. $100,000 would let him retrain for a different career and keep his house. I understood completely, because I was drowning in medical debt too, and my family was about to lose everything. Joanne set up a conference call with me, Nadia, and Clayton the next day. She explained what accepting the settlement really meant. The restaurant chain would pay us off and make us sign papers promising never to talk about Rick or what he did. They would face no public accountability and could quietly shuffle the whole problem away. The company that let Rick hurt people for years would get to pretend none of it happened. She said the choice was ours to make, but she thought we should reject the settlement and go to trial. A public trial would force the company to admit they knew about Rick and ignored complaints. It might prevent the next manager like Rick from hurting people because companies would know they couldn't just pay victims to stay quiet. Nadia spoke first and said she wanted to accept the settlement. She couldn't afford to keep fighting when she had rent due and no job lined up. I understood completely because I was in the same situation with medical bills I couldn't pay and a family depending on me. But then I thought about the next person Rick would hurt if we let the restaurant chain buy our silence. Some other kid would take a job there and get hurt by whatever manager replaced Rick, and they wouldn't know the company had a history of ignoring abuse. The $100,000 would save my family right now, but it wouldn't stop the pattern that hurt me and Nadia and Clayton and 3 other people before us. I called Joanne that night and told her I wanted to reject the settlement. My voice shook when I said it, because turning down $100,000 felt crazy when we were drowning in bills. She asked if I was sure, and I said yes, even though my hands were sweating and I felt sick. Mom sat across from me at the kitchen table looking scared, but she reached over and squeezed my good hand. She told me she supported whatever I decided and that some things mattered more than money. I knew she was terrified about how we'd pay the bills, but she didn't try to change my mind. Clayton called me 2 days later to say he was taking the settlement. His voice sounded tired and guilty, like he thought I'd be mad at him. I told him I understood completely, because his shoulder surgery cost even more than my hand, and he had a house payment to worry about. He said the money would let him go back to the school and learn something new since construction was impossible now with the nerve damage. I said that made total sense, and I meant it. Nadia sent me a text message the same day saying she was accepting too, because she couldn't afford to wait months for a trial that might not even go our way. I texted back that I didn't blame her at all and wished her the best. Joanne called after she heard about their decisions and said my case was still solid on its own. She explained that Clayton and Nadia accepting settlements actually helped me because it proved the restaurant chain knew they were in trouble and willing to pay to make problems disappear. Physical therapy 3 times a week became my new routine. The therapist was a middle-aged woman who didn't sugarcoat anything. She made me do exercises that hurt so bad I cried, but she said consistent work might save some function. After a month of squeezing therapy putty and picking up tiny objects, I could use my damaged fingers for basic stuff, but the fine control was gone. She sat me down one afternoon and explained this was probably my permanent baseline. I'd regained maybe 60% function, which meant I could hold things and do most daily tasks, but delicate work was over. Writing was messy, buttoning small buttons took forever, and anything requiring precision was basically impossible. She said I'd done well considering how bad the burns were, but my hand would never be normal again. I tried getting a job at a different restaurant because I needed money, and that was the only work I knew. The manager seemed nice when he hired me and said he'd heard about what happened with Rick. I started as a prep cook doing basic cutting and food assembly, but my hand shook whenever I got stressed, and I dropped things constantly. Knives slipped from my grip, plates crashed to the floor, containers spilled everywhere. After 2 weeks, the manager pulled me aside and gently suggested this wasn't working out. He wasn't mean about it, but the message was clear. I walked out knowing my restaurant career was probably finished. All those years of experience meant nothing when my hand couldn't do the job anymore. The occupational health doctor examined my hand for an hour, making me do tests and measuring my grip strength and finger movement. She typed notes into her computer while I waited. Finally, she turned around and said, I had a permanent partial impairment that limited my ability to do food service work. The words hit hard even though I already knew my hand was messed up. Permanent meant forever. She said this determination would help with workers' compensation claims, but it also meant accepting my hand would never fully heal. I was 22 years old with a disability that would affect every job I tried to get for the rest of my life. Kieran Wolf called to tell me Rick's criminal trial got scheduled for 2 months out. He warned me that Rick's defense lawyer would try to make me look unreliable by attacking my stutter and claiming I was faking my injuries for money. He said I needed to prepare for them going after my credibility hard. We set up practice sessions where he'd ask me questions like the defense would, trying to trip me up or make me angry. He taught me techniques to stay calm when they attacked me and how to manage my stutter under pressure. He kept saying I didn't have to be perfect, just honest, but I knew the jury would judge me on how I came across. Joanne filed a separate civil lawsuit against both Rick and the restaurant chain a few weeks later. She explained that workers' compensation only covered medical bills and lost wages, but not pain and suffering or future losses. The civil suit was asking for money to compensate for permanent disability, emotional trauma, and punitive damages to punish the company for ignoring complaints about Rick. She said the criminal conviction would help the civil case if we got one. I signed papers for hours while she explained what each document meant. Sarah had to testify at a labor board hearing about workplace conditions under Rick's management. I went to support her even though I wasn't testifying that day. She sat at a table with a microphone and described the fear everyone felt working for Rick. She talked about constant threats against anyone who complained and how Rick would mock people's disabilities or personal problems to humiliate them. She explained that calling 911 for me meant losing her job, but she couldn't watch me die in the dish pit. Her voice stayed steady the whole time, even when Rick's lawyer tried to make her seem like a troublemaker. Watching her refuse to back down made me proud to know her. The labor board announced their decision 3 weeks after Sarah's testimony. They fined the restaurant chain $200,000 for safety violations and ordered new worker protection policies at every location. They had to implement anonymous reporting systems and regular safety training and surprise inspections. Joanne said it wasn't enough to fix everything, but it was something. The company would have to change at least some of their practices because the labor board would be watching them now. I felt like we'd accomplished something even if it was small compared to what Rick had done. A letter arrived at my apartment addressed to me personally. Inside was 3 pages, handwritten by someone named Jennifer, who said she used to work for Rick 4 years ago. She described how Rick broke her wrist by slamming a freezer door on her hand when she tried to leave early for a family emergency. He forced her to work the rest of her shift with a broken wrist and threatened to fire her if she went to the hospital. She said seeing the news coverage about my case gave her courage to file her own complaint with the labor board. She thanked me for speaking up because it made her realize she wasn't alone and what happened to her wasn't okay. I read the letter 3 times and then called Kieran Wolf to tell him about it. He said this was exactly what he hoped would happen because it showed Rick's pattern went back even further than they knew. Kieran called 2 days after Jennifer's letter arrived and told me 4 more people had contacted his office with stories about Rick going back 3 years. He said they were looking into whether they could file more charges now that the pattern was becoming clear. Each new person who came forward made the case stronger, but also made me realize how many years Rick had been hurting people without anyone stopping him. I asked if any of them wanted to testify, and Kieran said 2 of them were willing to go on record if it went to trial. The others were too scared of Rick, even though he was in jail waiting for his hearing. Mom came into my room that night after my sister went to bed and sat down on the edge of my mattress with this look on her face that made my stomach drop. She told me she needed to be honest about something, and then explained she'd taken out a loan against the car to cover my medical bills because the insurance deductible was too high. The interest rate was 18%, and the total amount was $8,000 that we'd be paying back for years. I felt sick listening to her describe the monthly payments and how tight money would be, even with both of us working. Rick's assault had spread through my family like poison, infecting everything we tried to build. I told her I was sorry, and she said it wasn't my fault, but I knew the truth was more complicated than that. If I'd quit the first time Rick threatened me, if I'd reported him earlier, if I'd been stronger somehow, maybe we wouldn't be drowning in debt now. My sister's specialist appointment finally happened 3 weeks later, and Mom took her while I stayed home because I couldn't afford to miss my physical therapy session. When they got back, Mom looked exhausted, and my sister was quiet in a way that scared me. The doctor had said the treatment couldn't wait any longer, or the condition would get worse, which meant more medical bills on top of everything we already owed. I sat in the kitchen after dinner and thought about how Rick had reached into my life and broken everything that mattered. My hand, my job, my family's financial security, my sister's health care. The damage kept spreading outward in circles I couldn't control or stop. Joanne called the next morning with news that actually felt like good news for once. She'd negotiated with the restaurant chain's lawyers and gotten them to agree to a partial advance on the civil case so we could pay some immediate bills. They wanted to look cooperative before trial and were willing to put up $15,000 now. It wouldn't cover everything we owed, but it would handle the medical debt and keep us from losing the car. I asked if accepting the money would hurt our case later, and Joanne said no. It was separate from the final settlement. She said the check would arrive within a week, and I could barely believe something was finally going right. When I told Mom, she cried with relief and hugged me so tight, my ribs hurt. Kieran set up practice sessions at his office to prepare me for testifying at the criminal trial. We met 3 times a week for 2 hours each time, while he asked me questions the way Rick's defense lawyer would, trying to trip me up or make me angry. He taught me breathing techniques to manage my stutter under stress and how to pause when I needed to, instead of pushing through and making it worse. He showed me how to stay calm when someone attacked my credibility and how to answer questions directly without getting defensive. He kept saying I didn't need to be perfect, I just needed to be honest. But I knew the jury would judge me based on how I came across. If I seemed weak or unreliable, Rick might walk free. The night before the trial started, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and couldn't sleep because my brain kept replaying every possible way Rick's lawyer might make me look stupid in front of the jury. I imagined my stutter getting so bad I couldn't finish sentences, or Rick smirking while I struggled to speak, or the jury deciding I was lying about everything. Around midnight, Sarah texted asking if I was awake, and when I said yes, she showed up at my apartment 20 minutes later with coffee and sat on my floor talking until 3 in the morning. She reminded me that I wasn't the one who should feel ashamed, that Rick was the criminal, that telling the truth was enough. Her being there helped more than she probably knew. Walking into the courtroom on the first day of trial felt like stepping into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The room was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lights that made everything look harsh and cold. I had to walk past Rick to get to the witness waiting area, and he stared at me with this expression like I was the one who had wronged him, like I'd betrayed him by reporting what he did. My hand started throbbing with phantom pain from the memory of that night in the dish pit, the hot water on my burned skin, his laughter echoing through the kitchen. I sat down in the hallway outside the courtroom and focused on breathing the way Kieran had taught me. Through the courtroom doors, I could hear Kieran presenting the security footage to the jury on a big screen. I couldn't see it from where I sat, but I'd watched it during preparation and knew exactly what they were seeing. Rick deliberately bumping me toward the fryer, the oil splashing across my hand, me dropping the basket and grabbing my wrist in pain. The footage didn't lie about what happened that night, and Kieran said later that several jurors looked visibly angry while watching it. One woman in the front row had put her hand over her mouth, and another juror was shaking his head. The video made everything real in a way that words couldn't capture. Rick's defense attorney spent an hour arguing that the oil splash was an accident, and Rick was just using tough love coaching methods that were common in the restaurant kitchens. He tried to paint Rick as old school and demanding but not criminal, someone who believed in hard work and discipline. But then Kieran brought out the journal entries and read them out loud in court. You can't accidentally plan to injure someone in writing, can't document your strategy for forcing employees to quit, and then claim it was all a misunderstanding. The jury heard Rick's own words describing me as a target, planning the oil temperature, choosing the timing. The defense attorney's argument fell apart right there in front of everyone. When they called me to testify, I walked to the witness stand with my legs shaking and my damaged hand clenched in a fist. I swore to tell the truth, and then spent 3 hours describing the burn, the forced work in the dish pit, Rick mocking my stutter in front of the whole staff, and the collapse that finally brought help. My speech broke apart multiple times, and I had to stop and breathe and start sentences over, but I pushed through because Kieran said the jury needed to hear it from me. Afterward, he told me my struggle to speak had made the testimony more powerful because it showed the real impact of Rick's harassment. The jury had watched me fight to get words out and seen the disability Rick had weaponized against me. Rick's lawyer stood up for cross-examination and walked toward me with papers in his hand. He smiled at the jury before turning to face me. The smile disappeared when he looked my way. He asked if I was really claiming that my hand was permanently damaged or if I was just trying to get money from his client. I held up my bandaged hand and said the doctors already testified about the nerve damage. He cut me off and said he wanted me to show the jury what I could actually do with my hand, not just talk about what doctors said. The judge told me to stand up and demonstrate my hand function. My legs shook as I walked to the evidence table where they had a pen sitting on top of some papers. The lawyer told me to pick up the pen and write my name. I reached for the pen with my damaged hand and tried to grip it between my thumb and index finger. It slipped out immediately and clattered onto the table. The jury leaned forward in their seats, watching. I tried again, concentrating hard on making my fingers work the way they used to. The pen fell again. My face burned with shame, but I picked it up a third time, and this time it dropped before I even got it halfway to the paper. The lawyer started to say something about my demonstration, but one of the jurors in the back row shook her head, and another man crossed his arms looking angry. The lawyer's plan to prove I was faking had completely backfired because everyone in that courtroom just watched me struggle with something as basic as holding a pen. He dismissed me quickly after that, and I walked back to my seat feeling exposed, but also relieved that the jury had seen the truth. Sarah took the witness stand next, and the bailiff swore her in. Kieran asked her to describe what happened when the paramedics arrived at the restaurant. Her voice came out steady and clear, without any of the fear she'd shown that night. She said Rick had physically blocked the doorway when the EMTs tried to enter with their equipment. She described how the paramedic had to push past him to reach me, collapsed in the dish pit. Kieran asked what Rick's reaction was when the paramedic said I needed immediate surgery. Sarah looked directly at the jury and said Rick's face showed anger, not concern. She said he looked mad about getting caught, not worried about my welfare at all. She described how he'd grabbed the EMT's arm trying to prevent treatment while yelling about workers' compensation fraud. The defense attorney stood up for his turn and immediately suggested that Sarah was a disgruntled employee seeking revenge against Rick. She stayed calm and said she had no reason to lie since the restaurant had already rehired her with back pay. He pushed harder, asking if she'd been planning to sue the company herself. She said no. She just wanted to tell the truth about what she witnessed. Then he made a mistake and asked if she'd seen Rick mistreat other employees before my injury. Sarah's face got serious, and she started listing incidents. She described him forcing another cook to work with a sprained wrist. She talked about him making a server continue her shift after she burned her arm on a hot plate. She mentioned him threatening to fire anyone who complained about unsafe conditions. The defense attorney tried to stop her, but she kept going, her voice getting stronger with each example. By the time he finally sat down, the jury had heard about a pattern of abuse that went way beyond just my case. After a week of testimony, both sides gave their closing arguments. Rick's lawyer stood in front of the jury and argued that his client was just a tough manager who used old-school methods that might seem harsh but weren't criminal. He said the oil splash was an accident, and Rick's response was poor judgment, not assault. He claimed Rick deserved discipline and maybe a civil penalty, but not jail time. Then Kieran Wolf got up for his closing argument. He held up copies of Rick's journal and read selected entries out loud to remind the jury about the premeditation. He pointed at the security footage still image showing Rick deliberately bumping me toward the fryer. He reminded them about the 3 previous employees hospitalized under Rick's management. He said this wasn't about tough love or old-school discipline. It was about a man who systematically injured employees he wanted to get rid of. He argued that Rick's journal proved intent, the security footage proved action, and my permanent hand damage proved harm. That combination made this assault, not negligence. The jury filed out to deliberate while I sat in the hallway with Mom and Sarah waiting. 6 hours passed and I couldn't eat or focus on anything except watching that courtroom door. Finally, the bailiff came out and said the jury had reached a verdict. We filed back in, and I had to sit there while the jury foreman stood up. He read the verdict on each charge. Guilty of assault. Guilty of criminal negligence. Guilty of labor law violations. Rick sat completely still with no expression on his face while the judge thanked the jury. But I felt something release in my chest that had been tight and painful since the night I got burned. The tension that had lived in my body for months finally loosened, just a little bit. 2 weeks later, we came back for sentencing. The judge had read all the victim impact statements and reviewed Rick's criminal history. She said workplace abuse was a serious crime that destroyed lives, and Rick's calculated pattern made it worse. She sentenced him to 18 months in county jail, plus 3 years probation after release. She also ordered him to pay full restitution for my medical bills and lost wages. Kieran told me afterward that 18 months was actually a strong sentence for this type of case, since most workplace assault charges got pleaded down to probation. I wanted more time, wanted Rick locked up for years, but Kieran explained that the criminal justice system rarely gave long sentences for workplace crimes. At least Rick would spend over a year in jail and have a felony record that would follow him forever. A month after the criminal verdict, Joanne called to say the restaurant chain wanted to settle the civil lawsuit. They offered $350,000 to avoid a trial where more evidence about corporate negligence would become public. She said the criminal conviction had scared them because it proved they'd employed someone who deliberately hurt workers. She recommended accepting the settlement since a trial could take another year and might not result in a bigger payout. I talked it over with Mom, and we agreed that $350,000 would change our lives even after legal fees and medical bills got paid. I signed the settlement papers the next week. After Joanne took her percentage and the hospital got paid for the surgery and all the follow-up care, I ended up with about $200,000. It felt like both a fortune and nowhere near enough money to make up for a permanently damaged hand at age 22. The settlement couldn't give me back full use of my fingers or erase the months of pain and stress. Money didn't fix everything that Rick had broken in my life, but it was something real and concrete that could help my family stop drowning. I used some of the settlement money to pay off the loan Mom had taken against our car. The 18% interest had been eating us alive, and now that debt was gone completely. Then I covered all of my sister's upcoming specialist appointments and treatments that insurance wouldn't pay for. Mom cried when I told her the medical bills were handled, and she wouldn't have to work double shifts anymore. She kept saying she couldn't believe the nightmare was finally over, but I knew it wasn't really over, because my hand would never be the same, and the trauma from what Rick did still woke me up at night sometimes. Still, lifting the immediate financial crisis that had been crushing our family for years felt huge. 3 weeks after the settlement paperwork got signed, Joanne called me about the restaurant chain's new policies. They were putting together mandatory safety training for all managers at every location, plus setting up an anonymous hotline where workers could report abuse without getting fired. She said these changes wouldn't exist without the trial making everything public and forcing corporate to admit they had a problem. The new policies wouldn't help me since my hand was already ruined and Rick was already in jail. But maybe they'd stop the next manager like him from hurting people. I thought about all the workers who might avoid what happened to me because the company finally cared more about safety than protecting bad managers. It didn't fix my damaged fingers, but it meant something. I spent 2 days looking at community college websites and program descriptions before finally picking business management as my major. My hand couldn't handle restaurant work anymore with the limited movement in my fingers, so I needed a career path that didn't require fine motor control in my dominant hand. Business management seemed practical, and the settlement money meant I could actually afford tuition without drowning in student loans. I also looked at social work programs because maybe I could use what happened with Rick to help other people dealing with workplace abuse. The enrollment counselor helped me fill out all the paperwork, and I registered for fall semester classes. Walking out of the admissions office with my student ID felt like the first real step toward a future that wasn't just survival. Physical therapy sessions continued 3 times a week for the next 4 months, and I pushed through the exercises even when they hurt. The therapist measured my progress every 2 weeks, and we watched the numbers slowly climb from 60% function to 65, then 70, then finally plateau at about 75%. She explained that this was probably my permanent baseline because the nerve damage had limits on how much it could heal. 75% was better than the doctors initially thought I'd get, but it still meant I couldn't do things that needed precise finger control. I started learning to write with my left hand because my right hand's grip was too shaky for anything detailed. The adaptation process was frustrating and slow, but I got better at working around what my damaged hand couldn't do anymore. Sarah texted me regularly, and we met up for coffee every couple weeks to talk about how things were going. She'd found a job at a different restaurant across town, where the manager actually followed safety rules and treated the staff like human beings instead of disposable labor. She told me it felt almost surreal to work somewhere with proper training and equipment that actually functioned, where asking for a break didn't get you screamed at. We were bonded now by the experience of standing up to Rick together, her risking her job to call the ambulance, and me pushing through the trial instead of taking the easy settlement. Our friendship was built on something real and heavy that most people never had to deal with. 6 months after the criminal trial ended, a state representative's office contacted me about testifying at a legislative hearing on workplace abuse. They were considering new laws to protect service workers from the kind of treatment Rick had gotten away with for years. I agreed to speak and spent a week preparing my testimony about what happened and why stronger protections mattered. The hearing room was formal and intimidating, with legislators sitting at a raised desk looking down at the witness table. I sat in front of a microphone and told my story to the committee, describing the burn and the forced work, and Rick's journal planning my injury. My stutter barely showed up this time because I was talking about something I understood in my bones: the real cost of staying silent when someone hurts you because you need the paycheck. The representatives asked questions and took notes and thanked me for my courage, though I didn't feel particularly courageous since I was just explaining what happened. 2 weeks after the legislative hearing, I got an email from a workers' rights organization asking if I'd be willing to share my story at other events and meetings. They wanted to use real examples of workplace abuse to show people why these protections mattered, and to help other workers understand they didn't have to accept mistreatment just because they were desperate for money. I thought about it for a few days before responding yes. If telling people what Rick did to me could help someone else recognize abuse and get out before it destroyed them, then reliving the worst experience of my life served a purpose beyond just my own recovery. The organization started booking me for speaking events at union meetings and worker advocacy groups. My hand developed this ache whenever it rained, a deep throb in the damaged tissue that no amount of pain medication could fully stop. I couldn't open tight jars anymore, or hold small objects steady, or do detailed work that required precise finger movements. Learning to work within these permanent limitations instead of mourning everything I'd lost took time and patience I didn't always have. Some days I got frustrated trying to button a shirt or type on my phone and wanted to scream at how unfair it was that Rick's violence had taken away abilities I'd always counted on. But the settlement money meant I could focus on the school instead of working 2 jobs just to survive, which changed everything about my future options and gave me space to adapt. A year after the burn happened, I was doing okay in a way that felt real instead of fake. Not perfect, because my hand still hurt and limited what I could do, and not completely healed, because the trauma from Rick's abuse still showed up in nightmares sometimes. But genuinely okay with a path forward through college and actual hope for a career that didn't involve desperate survival. My family wasn't drowning in medical debt anymore, thanks to the settlement paying off Mom's car loan and covering my sister's treatments. Rick was in jail where he couldn't hurt anyone else for at least another 6 months. I'd turned the worst thing that ever happened to me into testimony that might protect other people through new laws and corporate policy changes. That felt like enough. Not perfect justice, but enough to live with.